As I mentioned earlier, this is Parshat Re'eh, and if you read the first verse of Parshat Re'eh, verse 26, this is an interesting one, the way it starts. See, which is Re'eh, and that's, by the way, in the singular. See, this day I set before you blessing and curse. Blessing if you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I enjoin upon you this day, and curse if you do not obey the commandments of the Lord your God, but turn away from the path that I enjoin upon you this day, and follow other gods whom you have not experienced. So before I get into this too much, what's people's initial reaction to that? Any general reactions to see this day I set before you in blessing and curse? Nothing?
It's a little intimidating.
It's a little intimidating, okay.
Well, it indicates that you have control. So you can.
What was that, Robin?
It indicates that you have control. You can choose which way you want to live, and here are the consequences.
Okay, that's a real good way to look at it. You have control over your actions, but obviously within some parameters. You have to obey the commandments, and if you ignore the commandments and go worship other gods, then you suffer the consequences. So if we...
I don't understand the last 5 words. Why is that in there? Whom you have not experienced. What does that mean? Why didn't he just end it at period of the gods?
Okay, so John is focusing on the last words of that, whom you have not, follow other gods whom you've not experienced. So remember, back in those days, it was mostly a polytheistic society, and the land that they were about to enter with the Canaanites and I forgot whatever other groups of people were there, they were polytheistic in their approach to finding the divine truth. And basically what God is saying, he's telling the people, God is telling the people that if you follow these other gods when you come into the land, keep in mind that I'm the one that rescued you from Egypt. I'm the one that carried you through the desert. I'm the one that brought you to this thing. So basically, even if you think that there are other gods, I'm the one that has brought you to this point in your lives. And that's the way the sages interpret that. So even if there were other gods, even if you thought there were other gods, basically God is telling you that your loyalty should be with me. So if people, we saw what happened to Korach and Dathan and Abiram, who decided to challenge this concept that, God is only focused on this one group of people. Why should we follow all these rules? And bottom line, it was a rebellion. And at least according to the Torah, God did not take kindly to that, and they ended up perishing when they tried to rebel. So I was thinking about this the other day. The television just happened to be on, and I think it was an episode of Star Trek. And growing up, I used to be a big fan of Star Trek, and because there were a lot of hidden messages in Star Trek that if you listened closely, you could make some real analogies, juxtapositions with our current society. And I don't know if anybody else on here was a Star Trek fan, but there was one episode there, well, there were several episodes. You may remember a people that was called the Borg, and the Borg represented this collective society. And basically, once you became part of the Borg, you were latched on through this giant network, and for all practical purposes, you had no individuality whatsoever. Everything was done as a collective. And the way they conquered people, they assimilated the people. They didn't necessarily wipe them out, although that often happened when there was resistance to the Borg. And their famous line was, "Resistance is futile." So it was basically taking away the individuality, and everyone was all connected in this giant network. So I had missed the beginning of this particular episode, but somehow a Borg had crashed, and the Starship Enterprise found him and brought him on board, and they healed him, and then they were trying to decide what to do with him. And the thing was, with this whole situation, while this particular Borg was on board the Enterprise, the main engineer there, Geordi LaForge, he actually became friends with this Borg. And now it comes time to decide what to do with this Borg. And the captain, who had never met this particular Borg, just knew the Borg from past experiences. And he said, "This is just a trick, it's just a way." And they finally convinced the captain to go and actually speak with him. When he did, the captain realized that this Borg somehow, in their presence, had become an individual, and even though it was still a Borg, was still connected to the network, this particular Borg had become an individual. And it just struck me as like, yes, we can be part of a collective. How much do we have in terms of individuality if we're following these certain parameters? And if we look down at the comment on the bottom, it says, "See," in other words, a visual thing, "See," you're looking at it with your own eyes. "See, this day I set before you a blessing and a curse." We've learned that different people absorb information in different ways. Some by seeing, some by hearing, some by touching. Those Israelites who were not persuaded by hearing God's commandments at Sinai or by hearing Moses' exhortations are asked to see the difference that following God's ways can make in one's life. The distinguishing characteristic of human beings, setting us apart from other animals, is our ability to choose the values by which we decide to live. Other animals are driven by instinct. The Torah repeatedly affirms that humans have the potential, like Robin said, to control their instinct. At our best, we are greater than the angels, who don't have to overcome temptation and apathy. At our worst, we are less than beasts. Their destructiveness is part of their nature. Human cruelty is the result of choice. So going with this whole idea, the individual versus the collective, I mean, back in those days, did people have the opportunity really to follow their own path and not really follow all the parameters that God has set down with the commandments? So I'll pose that question to you. Did people back then have this individual capability, or were they all part of this great collective, and why? What do you think? Jill, you're shaking your head. Unmute.
I don't know, because we can't go back in time. So it's just what the lore handed down from generation to generation and how we choose to interpret it. we cannot know what life was like then. We can only imagine it. So I have trouble with the basic question of at the time the story of these stories, did people have individual choice? We don't know. They may have had to stay to the group with the group in order to survive, or maybe not. We don't know.
Okay. Any other thoughts on that?
They probably weren't that educated.
They probably weren't what?
Educated. They weren't educated, so they only know what was told them and taught to them, and by the Kohen probably, the only people maybe. So I don't think they had a lot of worldly experiences to be able to compare their education to know of anything else.
Okay. So maybe education contributes to this idea of individuality or collectivity. And where do we draw the boundaries to that? This is a tough question. I mean, look what's been happening over the last month and a half to 2 months or so with all the protests. If a whole group of protesters is coming up and you're kind of on the sidelines here, when they come up to you and say, take a knee, do you take a knee? Are you in support of the Black Lives Matter movement, or are you against us? You know, I've kind of thought about this question long and hard. Would I be able to take a knee from my own personal perspective? I don't think that I could, because of all the mishigas surrounding the Black Lives Matter, the organization. I can't really support that, especially with their general perceived attitude towards the Jews themselves. I support the concept of the Black Lives Matter, but I can't support the organization. And would I be forced into doing something against my will at this point in time? I don't know. I've often thought about that, and I really don't know how I would react at that point if I was faced with that choice. So basically, God is saying that if we follow this way of life, we'll bring blessing to ourselves. And by the way, one of the other things that's mentioned in this chapter, Judaism does not frown on gaining abundance, but it's what you do with that abundance that makes your wealth either a tool or a goal. And that's actually in this parsha. So any reactions so far to what we've been saying, what we've been talking about? So I'd like to kind of just wrap this up with a commentary that really struck me, and this is from Rabbi Stephen Carroll, and I found this actually on the My Jewish Learning website, my go-to site, sorry. So remember, keep in mind that the Israelites are poised to enter the land that's been promised to them, but it's not going to just be given to them. They are going to have to take it, as we found today in today's portion. So that's a little bit of a tough pill to swallow. You know, maybe later on, once everything is done, they'll be able to reach out to their neighbors in peace. But there's a lot of commentary on that, but I don't want to focus on that today. So this whole idea, see this day I set before you, blessing and curse. How do you see a blessing and a curse set before you? How do you actually see this? Well, he talks about it this way. Why does the first sentence of this portion begin with the imperative form of the verb, see? Although the alternatives between blessing and curse are clear, do the people really have the freedom to choose between them without fearing that they are offending God? Is the power of positive thinking at work in verse 29, which says, when Adonai God, your God brings you into the land that you're about to invade and occupy, rather than if God brings you in. Is this meant to have special significance for the people who are about to enter Canaan? Well, the rabbis of the Talmud note that the Hebrew grammar in this phrase is surprising. It begins with the singular and it ends with the plural. Obviously, the rabbis see a great question in this. What's the lesson that's buried in that awkward formation, beginning with the singular and ending with the plural? So the sages state from the singular, re'eh, we learn that the mitzvot are given to the entire people, to all Jews as a group. The contours of our religion are not the personal preference of each individual Jew. At the same time, though, the phrase ends with lifnechem, before you, which is all, plural. It's to remind us that each individual must decide whether or not to commit heart, mind, and soul to cultivating this particular covenant with God. And that's the comment from Rabbi Bradley Shavit Atzen from the Ziegler School of Rabbinics. This verse, this week's opening verse reminds me of an old song titled, "What a Difference a Day Makes." See, the word see, we read, "I give you a blessing and a curse." For the Israelites, as for us, that day changed our lives. We learned to choose blessing as our lot. The verb in I give you ought to read in the past tense. I gave. The Torah already has been given, after all. Moses is just recapitulating its contents here. But tradition insists that we read it as I give. This week's blessing is not about some historical fact that happened once and for all. It's about ongoing human existence. Apparently, we have an ever-present gift from God, an ever-present choice. Perhaps between blessing and curse. And that's from Rabbi Lawrence Hoffman in his book, Mixed Blessings, What a Difference a Day Makes. They're virtually twins, two average peaks in a land where Himalayan ecstasies are not part of the landscape. Average mountains, average children. However, the peak of blessing, Mount Gerizim, which is mentioned in the next paragraph that we didn't read just yet, Mount Gerizim is nearer the sun, moist and fruitful. The peak of the curse, Mount Eval, is lean, arid, and dry. Rambam adds a mystical dimension. Of these two mountains, Gerizim is to the south, symbolizing divine love. Eval is to the north, symbolizing strict justice and law. And they give the example, Rambam gives the example, parents must give their children love and limits, concerns, and curtailments. When push comes to shove, the ultimate choice in favor of blessing will depend on the strength of the portion of love. So Rabbi Atzen states that Judaism is not based on the personal preference of each individual Jew. When should we put the good of the community above our own personal preference? Pointing out the potential of one's actions was Moses' role and remains the role of the rabbis today. How much influence do you think present-day rabbis have on the lives of those they lead? Well, I guess in different communities, that answer will vary. So it's truly a blessing, as Rabbi Hoffman says, for us to be able to choose between blessing and curse. Would you rather have someone choose it for you? Because, and this is Rabbi Carroll's commentary, because I'm primarily a visual learner, I'm attracted to the first word of this portion, re'eh. I remember someone's phone number better if I visualized it on a list. I read from the Torah better if I can picture the vowels that were in the tikkun, which is what traditionally the Torah reader would use to learn the cantillation. I recall experiences better if I can replay them in my head as if they were on a VCR in my brain. It seems to me that our ancestors who went out of Egypt were also visual learners. They lived in a country that was a feast for the eyes, even though they weren't able to partake of that feast. And this image stayed in their memories, that of Egypt. Consider that they had seen big buildings everywhere. The Egyptians had looked different than they did. The 10 plagues had been incredible sights, and the successful crossing of the Sea of Reeds and the drowning of the Egyptians came under the category of, I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. But the use of the word see at the beginning of Parshat Rei is about something other than the physical act of seeing. Of the more than 400 times in which the verb see is used in the Bible, this is one of the few times in which it has very special significance. And he goes on to give other examples. And most of these, we've seen in the different books of the Torah, in Genesis, in Exodus, in other places in Deuteronomy. Bottom line is, they often are connected with other events. But in each of the examples above, the speaker is announcing something that will have an impact on the future. We often use the imperative form when we want to get people's attention. For example, in today's day and age, when we're trying to make an important point, we say, look, this is what I want you to understand. Or, do you see what I mean? The word re'eh is a way of drawing attention to what is happening or what's about to happen, focusing on its importance and recognizing that the future will be different based on the choice that is about to be made. Whether or not you can see the blessings or the curses in front of you, you have to believe that you can. And then you have to believe that God has given you the ability to do what's right as an individual and as a member of the Jewish community. So with that, I leave you with the words, Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, the mountain of blessing and the mountain of curses, which one will you gravitate to in your own lives? Shabbat Shalom.
That's it, cool.